I'm Abigail Ogilvy of Abigail Ogilvy Gallery. We've been in the SOA area here for 9 years now. We moved to this location just last year, which is really exciting. And thrilled to introduce Janet Loren and Alex McClay. Janet is in town from New York City and a previous Bostonian. Alex is here from Cincinnati, Ohio. And then we have local textile artist Sam Fields here moderating our talk today. Thank you, Sam. Janet was actually Sam's student. Yes, I'm making sure we have a lot of teachers in the room. Janet was Sam's student at Mass Art, and Sam taught her how to weave and knit, so very important to Janet's career, clearly. And Alex is just a longtime fan of Sam's work, so there's really great energy between these three artists, and they have a lot to talk about today. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. So I thought just to get started, maybe each of you could walk us through the making of a piece and maybe tell us a little bit about your practice.
Sure. Mine starts in, let me know if I'm not talking out loud, I'll really work it. They start as stories in my head, so I'm building upon this character and a whole world, and I'm learning more and more about them as I make more paintings. So like this one, I started to think, what could cause these boundary flags to exist in this world? Like they can't just exist, they have to have sort of a source or an action. So one thought was maybe these chattering teeth toys get saturated in a word cloud, and then these flags are pulled sort of very aggressively from their void. So to live there, then I'll do a graphite sketch, and then I'll do a lot of color studies, because for me the color really drives both the luridness of it and also some sort of kick of sinister edge. So something really colorful, we're in like seafoam greens and bright yellows, but then we have like a dark Prussian blue sun. So something has occurred. It's not quite aligned. So that's how that works. Cool. Yeah.
My work definitely starts a little sort of differently. It starts with, most of the pieces here start with the words, start with the text, which I usually will take from my own journal entries or writing, stream of consciousness writing, or just things that I think of or hear throughout the day and jot down in my notes app. I don't know if anyone else does that, but notes app is the best. And I'll often like mine through my notes app or my journals and find bits of text that feel like they feel like I want to make physical, or feel like they could be poetic in off the page. And once I have that, I think about how I want to make them material, and what kind of materials I want to use. And then as far as the material goes, I feel like I started at the hardware store. And then, especially with pieces, these weavings over here, the mason line and the survey tape and the emergency blankets, they're just materials that I was drawn to while I was at the store, and I was like, I'm gonna get that. So it comes from collection, and kind of like sometimes serendipity, which I find very interesting, and then kind of naturally decide like this piece of text will go really well in this material form. So yeah, that's.
I'm gonna jump around and mix up my questions, because
Sure.
you're pointing out your materials, and I'd like to hear about your material choices as well, but they also made me think about borders and boundaries,
Yes.
the types of materials that you're using.
Absolutely, yeah. So the survey tape, the pink tape. Well, all the tape is used in the real world through different, like construction, for example, or people who work on land. So they are used to actually communicate. They have meaning without words, which I think is really interesting. And the color block series doesn't have words for that reason. But the pink means, or is used to mark and measure land or set like arbitrary boundaries. I think it's kind of strange, but that is what we use. The orange survey tape is used to mark communication lines in the real world, and then the green tape is used to mark waste lines. And then the silver is emergency blanket. So of course that can be used for all sorts of things, but really a means to an end, like a way to keep warm after you've run a marathon or if you're in danger. There's so many different ways that you can signal for help with it. They use it in NASA. And then there's also a Mason line in that as well. So that's like often used for leveling and stuff like that. Yeah.
And they sometimes use it if you've just witnessed something horrendous.
Yeah. I mean, like it's in your first aid kit, the emergency blankets. Yeah. Someone said it's the coldest warm you can feel, because often you're using it in like a dire situation. Obviously, running a marathon, your body is maybe mentally you're not in dire straits, but your body is. Yeah.
So very technically, what's happening is it's canvas at its center wrapped around upholstery foam in the older pieces or archival foam in the newer pieces, which is a little more rigid. And then handmade, knit, and crocheted elements by me, and then eBay found needlepoint and embroidery from all around the world in all different eras, which was a really purposeful choice on my part since I'm using plants and nature elements that I'm sourcing from propaganda posters all throughout history and time and location. I wanted there to be other makers' hands that weren't just mine, so coming from past generations or other places in the world that are connected to a rise in authoritarianism that we're seeing all around the globe right now, and has ebbed and flowed across time. But the color is sort of the sickly goo that connects across all of those materials.
Thanks. Can both of you kind of speak to the role of like craft in your work, whether it's like a history or process or politically?
So I come from a craft background. I studied for 2 years at Penland School of Craft and in North Carolina, where I got to take 14 different classes in a variety of crafts. So I have a great admiration for craft, and in some of my other practices, specifically my printmaking and bookmaking practices, it's something that I am incredibly diligent about how.
So meticulous.
Yeah, I'm very meticulous about how I approach that making. And with this work, this tapestry work, it's kind of been able to be a bit of a step back in that meticulousness, sort of. The beaded work towards the back of the room, it relates very much to my letterpress background, so like setting type, 10-point type, feels very similar to beading those tapestries with seed beads and bugle beads, the tiny things. But I actually just learned how to bead this year, so yeah, craft is something that really like propels my practice forward. I love learning new things and experimenting and harnessing the ability to do something do something in a powerful way. And because of my training, I feel like I trust my hands to be able to kind of like learn something from a book or a YouTube video, or whatever I need to do. I also feel like I've been able to kind of subvert the high craft, especially in the weavings where I'm using like such unusual material that you wouldn't like see in, you know, proper proper weaving. And I think there's an importance to that as well in the work. Also, there's some 3D printed work. The yes and no tapestries right there are made from 3D printed beads. So again, kind of like using a really unusual process or material to create something that is inspired by meticulous craft and doing something that like is, it's flipping the script,
Yeah, I think about craft as in a DIY sense, so it's something that you can make and wrap back up if you need to. So it has, I'm thinking about a lineage of protest history and political acts of craft, so the big, large AIDS quilt that was rolled out on the lawn, and the way that welcomes in multiple collaborative making sessions where a lot of storytelling also happens, which could either be yes and storytelling, sort of freehand or imaginative, but it could also be telling personal stories and finding those moments of overlap with one another. I think that when you're working on something and looking down, it's easier to share those hard truths with each other. So I appreciate that element of sort of useful distraction, I guess.
It's a beautiful space that opens up when you get to be with somebody else and work with your hands and talk at the same time.
Yes. Yeah, you're doing something where you could both fail too. So maybe it's okay if your words also fail a little.
It's very inherently vulnerable.
Yes.
Just to add to that, I was thinking about this earlier today. The role of women's work, I feel like, is pretty important in the specific craft languages that we're using. In the show, you're using embroidery and text and quilting, and weaving and beading, and all of these are very traditionally considered things that have been historically done by women. And I think that that's so important for what the message is in the show. Like, how different would it be if these works were paintings, or these messages were painted? I don't know. Some people have said, because I think painted is kind of steeped in like patriarchy, whereas textiles has this craft history of being very feminine. So I think there's just a huge importance to that.
Yes. And I think even in how you're handling your paint,
Absolutely,
is very much a quilting mark and an embroidered mark. It's very much a textile mark that's happening.
I can't tell you how many times people are standing in front of these and I'll start talking about mixing paint. They're like, well, where's the paint? And they will think that the whole thing's embroidered. That's a huge part for me too. I think about the way that the different mediums have been rigid or flexible in the past. So even the embroidery, when embroidery was first sort of popularized, it was in the form of set guides. Like you would get the image already on the grid. And then you're just filling in
my numbers.
But it was directed at women, and it was supposed to only be floral or sort of nascent sayings that supported this really limited space of domesticity, like home sweet home or pray it away or something like that. And the fear was, we can't let women make something from their own imaginations. Like, what awfulness would that bring? what structures
What
would that
environment.
break that down? Yeah. So I love that some of these are definitely from some of those most rigid times and were made by maybe women who would have made something else if they didn't have that set shadow to fill in.
Yeah, it also brings up the questions of like in Western art, the importance of authorship and like individuality, whereas craft has a history of community, and you pass down your patterns. You share patterns, and so I think that the two can be opposed, and by even using those, you are kind of questioning like, the role of importance of like authorship or maybe originality is not originality. Like everything has to be new, and why is that? Like why is that?
Or like the solo genius artist. Yeah, absolutely.
Creating work in a vacuum.
Yeah, what vacuum is that?
And we were even talking about your text before this started and how like someone had mentioned like another artist that used that saying, and then we came up with a bunch of other people that have actually said the same thing, and like that's not bad that you are participating in that without even knowing it.
Yeah.
You know that it's in the world, and like
We are bearing, you asked the question about bearing witness, and if you wanna, or that's kind of where that started, where that whole conversation started from, but I think it really ties into what we're talking about right now. And maybe you can speak to it a little bit, but the way I answered that, this is a little practice before.
I mentioned that I felt like looking at the show, there was a strong sense of the work bearing witness.
Yeah. And I told her how last night someone had said that these words were spoken by another artist. It's the not either or, but both. And I was talking to him about how all of those words in the beaded pages, the ones with the white frames, are words that we all have said at some point to ourselves or to somebody else, that they kind of like exist in our lexicon in our minds, and that they're not supposed to be like my original words that only I've said ever, you know, and also that they're not supposed to be just my story, and I don't want them to be just my story. I want you to be able to read them and finish the thought or finish the sentence with your own experience. So trying to really reflect your experience with the world, like back on yourself, and allow you space to consider that and reflect upon that.
Yeah, when I was thinking about bearing witness, I was thinking about the weight it can hold in your body, especially if it accumulates and you don't have a way to deal with it. It just hovers upon you. So for me, the work is a way to use a completely absurd story that's both silly but also so wrong that you can maybe see it a little bit more clearly. So in that way, it's prisming it, you know, taking a large amount of partial fragmented information that builds and builds and builds, and then as a sort of prism, honing it into something that can start to be tracked, and in that way maybe picked apart and not seen as like just the icky soup, but it's like, here's the ingredients that made up that soup. And maybe if we just start to question each one, we'll get to a new, more delicious thing.
It also, you talking about the weight on the body when you're holding these things, is the actual process of making the work, is that like, how is that helpful, or like how do you use that or not?
That's such an interesting question.
Does it help with that?
It does. I'm trying to think of how to put it into words. I think it's a way to, so in my practice, I'm researching a lot of really dark things, dark images. I'm on some dark Reddit threads. And it's gotten to the point where I need to now create like a false persona so that the algorithm can be a bit separated. Because I need to like set some boundaries about work life. But it allows me to take in the noise and then sit in quiet. And it gives me time to not be thinking about how that comes in an overly analytical way, but to let it sort of marinate and then come out in the choices that I'm making that maybe feel intuitive, but is actually based off of a long history of skills and study. So I can start to be less literal about how it comes in, but I know that I need gruesomeness in it. So I'm gonna leave the stitch sutures of the canvas. I'm not gonna polish it out because it's violent and it should live in the work too.
Yeah. I also, my work, comes from some dark places sometimes.
The brightest work, always
Yeah.
What you're talking about.
And not only research and other people's stories and other people's experiences, but also my own. And so physically making the work often, especially the very like tedious work, the beading work, allows me to be able to meditate and process those experiences. I think what you said, like you're taking all of this in and you have this quiet time and space to just let it like settle. Of course, what does that do to the body?
That's a different kind of different pain.
Yeah, it's a different.
Well, the making pain.
The making pain. There's the making pain. Yes, there's the making pain. But I think that like sitting with a lot of these stories and a lot of these experiences does affect the body, right? And part of the making allows me to release, like physically release the words, the thoughts, the feelings, like the anger, whatever it is. But I also just need other ways to release that. So stretching, yoga, therapy, all of these things, like they're all very important also to my practice and like feed back into my practice as well and allow me to like continue to make the work, because if I didn't do that, I don't think I could. Yeah.
The art can't do it all.
No, it really can't. That's too much pressure.
Yeah.
So we talked a little bit before about the idea of the grid. In weaving, it's most obvious maybe in weaving, but it's also in a lot of textile practices. And what are some ways, or even societal structures, like what are some ways that you see the work either breaking or using or interrupting that grid?
So I feel like the grid for me is like, it's how my brain works. When we were talking before, I made a joke about the old adage that like women's brains are waffles and men's brains are spaghetti. Or wait, no, maybe it's the opposite. Yeah, or maybe just like the type, like, so I feel like my brain is a waffle. Or maybe it's spaghetti and I'm trying to make it into a waffle, I'm not sure. But it,
If you put spaghetti in a waffle, it's not a waffle.
We
should
should
make
it's almost like a safety for me, a place of safety for me, and a place that I can explore, but I know that things will stay together in the end. That at the end of the day, with all the work I've put in, like, I'll take it off the loom and it won't all just like fall apart. But I also think that I've been kind of stuck in the grid, and after like talking with you guys, and I don't know, I'm really interested in something. This is something for like my future plans and my work is, how do I break out of that structure? Because I think it's possible that it's holding me back, or it's too safe. Like, I think I can find safety somewhere else and within myself. And I don't need to lean so much on the grid in my work. Because yeah, in a way, I think like societally, the structure is the best things happen when those structures are broken. So that's something I'm looking forward to.
And we also have rules for a time, and then when they're no longer useful to us, we break them, and then we set up new rules, and then when they're no longer useful, we break them.
Yeah.
That's just like part of the art practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, but it's something that like I've been thinking about since we first talked, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure the grid will show up in a different form, and I wonder what that would be.
I know, yeah, absolutely.
I think about the grid in like a nesting doll way. So patterns and systems for me compound, which makes them very hard to unlearn. As you sort of like untether one, and then all of a sudden it's like the grid's bouncing. It's lost. It's like net.
It's actually really a nice, like, the movement from this grid to the net.
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
flexible.
Yes.
The squares move into diamonds.
Yes.
Something.
Yeah. I clearly don't like rectangles. Even my rectangles.
If we were in critique right now, I would say, why?
Why?
You don't like rectangles.
I think the rectangle, for me, it's like, this is only true in maybe my work. I don't think I feel this way about it in other people's work. It's not like a dogma that I take towards everything, but for me, it's too constructed. And in painting, it's built into this mythos of like, painting is a window into another place where your soul can wander. Your disembodied eye will reach nirvana. I'm like, nobody is a disembodied eye, and I wouldn't want to be one. Like, that sounds like the Eye of Sauron. How awful. So, and the floor is that way too. Like, the wall is just an architectural structure that's meant to keep people out of spaces or hold people in spaces. But the floor is the ground, the floor is the earth. Yeah, the floor keeps us upright.
And connected.
And connected. Yeah. We can feel each other through the floor. So the grid for me is something that's like a haunting spectral force.
Can you talk to the shape of these?
Yes. I love hearing what people read them as, so I hope you can like hold what you read it as. Because from that I've heard womb, I've heard splitting cells. Last night I heard blood cells. My sort of starting point is that they're what you see through binoculars, which again, it feels like a very decontextualized viewpoint. You lose all your peripheral vision, which is there to keep you alive. It's so you can see the car coming around the corner. But if you had it all the time, your brain would actually not be able to do basic functioning. It's just like too much information. And then whatever you're looking for, it's gotta be like high spectacle. It's the hawk diving for the squirrel, or your cat. So it seemed like the perfect stage set for this highly problematized narrative of chattering teeth people up to no good.
And maybe the chattering teeth people can lead us into language.
Yes.
We also talked a little bit about the use of language in very different ways in both of your bodies of work.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
maybe we could even throw in like the idea of movement and language. If you want to go there, it's up to you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, when I think about weaving in language, I think about how like the weaving loom was kind of the starting point for the first computer, and I kind of relate these works very much to like the binary to computers, like coding, the way that I'm actually like beating the work, or it's very like pixelated. Everything's so it's in the grid, it's structured, it's pixelated. So that's kind of where that like through line is for me. And I also think about how we speak to each other, like with our mouths, and these obviously aren't using that. They aren't using that like organ or that tool. They're using the flat surface or the wall. They're creating what's really digital for us now. They're making that very physical. But I think like what's so different and what's interesting in the context of this show is that what's really absent in these pieces, which is the mouth, is so present in Janet's work.
But the words are like, I was looking
Not
at your
present.
little ceramic chattering teeth, and I just thought all these words need to like get put.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yeah. There's obviously like a very like there's a connection there between how the ways in which one can communicate. And then in your work, there's very much like an absence of text.
I think about too with your work, the fact that they're woven makes me think of the things we say to each other are connected to a longer history of patterns in our life. So it follows that same grid system. Like once you start to untangle the language for how we describe something, it'll show you so much about all the things that you took for granted as given and are not given at all. So when I look at your work, I think of all that, like to say yes or no in certain contexts is not simple.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because like in therapy, specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, they really try to kind of, or like a therapist, not they, like who's they, the people who practice this, they really try to examine the stories you tell yourself. So the thoughts in your head, the story you tell yourself about a specific event or about yourself, the thoughts in your head that actually are so far from the truth or so far from factual, but that have so much meaning and they really make you feel a certain way. So I mean, what we tell ourselves has meaning and it affects how we feel about ourselves and about other people and about the world. So speaking back to the idea of like the long history of what your experience is, how you've processed those experiences, what you told yourself about these experiences, that tapestry of your life.
What happens if you start cutting some of those strings?
Yeah.
What happens to your leaving?
Exactly. Well, the grid gets broken. That the tapestry of your life, it all kind of affects like your mental state in the present moment, and my mental state when I wove these or beaded these.
Yeah. I think that's why the chattering teeth wind-up toy is such a evil character to me. So evil, malicious. Because to fill space with nonsense and gish gallop and to not allow you to be silent with your thoughts, that is so obnoxiously dominant. And it makes you so concerned with trying to hold logic to an illogical structure that it's all happening out here. It's like, I mean, I'm sure you have this experience, but when your yarn gets tangled,
Oh my god.
and you work on it for like 4 hours, and then you realize, I can't, you are this thing now, no longer useful for me in this purpose. Maybe you'll come in on another way as some ambiguous yarn form, but the knots are not going to get untangled, and I've wasted so much time.
You could have just cut it.
You could have just cut it. I know.
I can't.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I was gonna say, I think we'll allow some questions.
yeah, that's great.
Can I hear from you? Let us know if you have questions about specific works or anything, for all three of them.
So Alex, you talk about how mouths aren't present in your work, but I feel like in the color scheme in particular, I mean,
Ooh, you're right.
that was never my impression of these women. For me, these did read very much as mouths, and you talked a little bit as kind of what you were thinking through with these structures, or kind of what they say to you, or if there's any interesting reads that you've heard on them before. I particularly love the kind of swoop in the orange one, but I'm just curious as to what your thought process is with those.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like, I think that's interesting because they're actually the only works that don't have text in them, but then they are referencing language through, like, the pink one that kind of reminds me of a tongue for sure. And then, you're right. There are these, like, kind of windows or, like, you know,
Voids.
What?
Or voids.
Or voids, yeah, and that's very much what your mouth is. So you make an excellent point. I should never say never. Yes. For me, these were, I was trying to do something different with these works. I actually made them right after I taught a very intense 2-month craft course at Penland in book arts and letterpress, and everything was about meticulous perfection. And every day I was getting up in front of a group of students and telling them how to do something, and I felt like everything had been so like controlled that I wanted to take away the pressure of text and experiment with these materials and what they can do, specifically with the Ryonaut. So once the heat comes on, you'll see everything like fluttering, but I was experimenting too with how what happens when you tie knots instead of doing the traditional like plain weave, and what happens to the material, how the material can interact with each other. And I had a lot of fun with these, and it really just kind of was like a release of a lot of pent up pressure and a creative like just kind of like a creative energy, like quick creative energy study or flow out of me, which again is interesting with their mouths. Thank you for that question.
I actually have a question. Janet, you showed with us 6 years ago in a group show, and the works were still very Moore Hill. There was painting on top of actually velvet in some instances. Incredible. And it was all looking at the back of your partner's head.
You all can see the back of his head
It
too.
looked kind of like this.
And again, kind of this like voyeuristic point of view. I mean, you're looking at someone in the back of their head. It's very almost like intimate thing. But how would you? I mean, thinking about your work progression and coming back to Boston, what do you think about those two series?
I think I've always enjoyed the slippage between the personal and the political. So even when I was painting Jordan's head, I was thinking about all the different sort of like romance tropes that we see over and over again in our culture and other cultures, and how they reinforce deeper problematics of our culture, but feels like a playful space. And I was trying to implicate myself in it too, so I would always pick a romance trope that I found on some level alluring. So these have really deep personal aspects to them too that I don't always talk about, that have to do with ways that people in my family have become indoctrinated in different ideologies, and how to navigate them and our relationship with this thing that's sort of like a constant barrier in how we can be two people with each other. So there's that, and then there's also just like patterns of family dynamics that are in it too. So I think it's the only way that I know how to talk about larger problems is to see how I show up in it, and hope that the viewer can meet me at that vulnerable space, and maybe together we can grow through it. Like that feels like true change, is when you both fail grandly. And then you have to make something new because like we've already hit this. That kind of thing. Good question.
I love that.
Yeah.
So you were talking about the weight of witnessing at one point, and I'm thinking about the physical weight of these, and this is very light, if you will, and seems a lot more heavy, and yet there's so much weight in words, right? Like there's so much weight in these, like the presence of both of them. I wondered if you thought about the sort of that aspect in terms of conditioning with being like the feminine versus masculine as well. Yeah, and then also the weight of observation. Seeing it. So yeah, just curious.
Oh, that's super interesting.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts? Because I feel like
Such a nightmare in my head. I was thinking like, I bet these are actually a lot heavier than these.
really,
Yeah, because beads are heavy.
yeah, actually, yeah,
And
they can be, yeah.
even, it's like how water is mysteriously heavy. You start to get like multiple gallons of water and you realize you're a weakling.
Yeah.
These are like actually really light. The ceramics are not, I'll give you that. But
The visual weight, there's a
Yeah.
visual weight to them.
yeah.
That these don't. These have a visual lightness to them.
Oh.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, like these definitely feel like they weigh a ton.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Even in like the shadows, I think they cast between the two.
Oh. I don't think I connected to anything gender related. I think that doesn't live there for me. But I'm gonna have to sit with it as a visual weight because that's actually important for me to hear.
Yeah. I think there's what I'm kind of thinking about with your question is, again, relating textiles to, like, we are all wearing textiles. And I think about that a lot in my work, how we are walking around using textiles as a literal boundary, every day, all day. And how there's a weight to that psychologically, but also, you know, it's light, it is light. I also, like, this is such a good question, I'm like a little bit stumped. Like something I haven't heard. Yeah, I haven't.
I think that like the visual lightness
Yeah.
helps me enter into the work a little unguarded.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I read, I'm like, oh.
Yeah.
And then I have to hold it. Whereas if it maybe didn't have that visual lightness to it, like it would be harder to enter in. And the same with yours, like there's a humor in your work that allows me, and the softness and the shape allows me to enter in, and then I'm like, there's something making me uncomfortable. But I think actually that's one of the great things about textiles is that we're still, maybe in another 15 years we won't be, but we're still caught off guard by it. Like we're still really familiar with it, like in clothing and blankets, and there's a softness to it. So like we get invited in, and then we're like, oh, then you give us this thing, and we may not have entered in the same way with the same willingness. That's just my take.
I love that take.
Yeah, feels very true to me. Absolutely. I hope that answers.
Yeah, I'm just that, as I think of everything in terms of weight, so.
It's interesting because I actually showed work with Abigail at Spring Break New York, and the piece was called "The Weight of an Action Accumulates," and it was cement beads.
I bet
that was so heavy. And it was worn at some point, at one point, with a performance, but they were all attached to the wall, and that had like, I think, a visual lightness to it because of how separated they were. They were dispersed.
And the color.
But then when you really think about like actually wearing those beads,
Did you cast them?
Oh my
gosh.
Yeah. So yeah, I think about weight a lot too. But yeah, I agree. I completely agree with you. The visual weight is so striking, the difference between our works. Yeah.
I think that might be a good place to end. Oh, Hillary.
So that was a very good question. Forgive me if I came in a little bit late, but Janet, the ceramic figure with the pennant, can you talk a little bit about that? And I think I'm like interested in, you know, is it a vessel maybe, but I haven't gotten up close with it yet, but also like the ratio of textile to ceramic, because like just how you're making those choices and thinking about this.
Yeah, I knew that I really wanted to try to, I sort of made the chattering teeth physicalized in the back, the little teeth. So I was like, well, the figures they could live in real world and start to be that uncanny valley of now the world's in our world, and what does that mean? But I was thinking about how nation states use both language and symbolism and people as symbols as a way to shepherd in violence. And an older version of that is the standard bearer who goes out in front of the army, or who holds guard outside of the resting place for the army, and announces, here's the nation that's coming to usurp or to conquer or to attempt something.
but it's typically the most zealot person who will take on, if it's voluntary, it's not always voluntary, will take on that role because you are the first targeted. Because if you take down the standard bearer, the symbol, you watch the flag fall. It's a moral defeat to the army. So I wanted to bring them into the space and have these two different landscapes where we're starting to see maybe them coming in and sort of mythos of this utopian rolling hills, the fields are full, the cattle is present and plump, and then here we're in like deep destruction with fire and it's so pretty there. Yeah, it's gotta be beautiful. But even the structure is the same, and it's from most of the different plants in both the pieces are from enlistment posters from different nations. The core Rolling Hills is from the American Army enlistment photo. And then a lot of them are actually different nations making posters for other nations. So some of them are Nazi posters for Belarus or for Norway. So appealing to their wants and desires and fears. One is like promising that Hitler will return farmland, which is an age-old practice of saying you're gonna give the farmers their land back. Yes, so that's what they're up to. It's tricky though, glaze doesn't want to be the color you expect it to be. So when you're a nerd about color, it can be kind of like an endless frustration, but it worked out.
I think you nailed it. Yeah.
It's a try.
Or we'll teach you things.
It's a t-shirt. It's a real t-shirt. It'll explode on you.
Well, thank you three. This was amazing, and thank you everyone for coming. I saw a lot of people taking notes by hand on their phones, so it seems like there was a lot of good content here. You guys were great. And yeah, enjoy the wine, and I hope you can chat with the artists.